Nothing justifies all this Turkish obduracy in keeping its troops in Idlib and threatening the Syrian Arab Army along with Russia and Iran, while investment in Turkish blood and Syrian blood reached its climax last Saturday when the Turkish army was exposed outside its legal territory. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin tried to get Turkey off the tree and suggested that it could remain in a border strip of 15 kilometers deep inside Syria, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan rejected the proposal and insisted on the withdrawal of the Syrian army from the liberated areas or to prepare to die for Idlib. Just when Syria's not-so-civil war is finally nearing its end, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan decided to gamble again, this time with the lives of Turkish troops rather than the Al-Qaeda mercenaries, by announcing Operation Spring Shield in Syria's Idlib. Yes, Syria's Idlib. When Erdogan very kindly gave 20 days ago the Syrian army until the end of February to withdraw, it was clear that he needed some time for the logistical mobilization of a large-scale military operation in Idlib, on the one hand, and that he was not so eager to enter into a direct clash with Syria and Russia on the other. In the meantime, he was continuing to play on both sides, calling on the United States to install Patriot missiles as he requested the support of NATO. The response was not too late to reject the Turkish request, whether it was the Patriot or the Atlantic intervention. Although he found himself alone in confronting Syria and Russia, Erdogan was completely defeated by the Assad dilemma in his head and chose the policy of escaping forward by embarking on a bloody adventure with the Syrian and Turkish armies. This was culminated by the arming of Al-Qaeda mercenaries with portable anti-aircraft missiles to shoot down Syrian and Russian jets, and with an attempt to retake the liberated Saraqib and other areas in Idlib and Aleppo by force. Erdogan believed that negotiations with fire might force the Syrians to accept his conditions, but the response came in a very strong and solid manner, and the result is the throwing of Turkish soldiers in the Idlib fire. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The Syrian army is dealing harsh blows to the Turkish-backed Takfiri terrorists in the southern outskirts of Idlib, as tensions in the conflict between Ankara and Damascus have soared to a dramatic level after dozens of Turkish troops were killed in air raids in the region. To discuss this issue with us from London is Danny Makki, who's a political analyst, a Syrian political analyst. Thank you very much for being with us, Danny. Now, Turkey did launch on Sunday a new aggression against Syria, a fresh military operation in Syria's Idlib, and they called it some sort of a spring operation, and it's an all-out war against Syria. There's no more hiding from that. And basically, it's because the mercenaries who were funded and trained by Turkey were failing and absolutely failed to retake Idlib or other areas, whether in northern Aleppo or otherwise. Now, how long do you think it will take the Turks and Erdogan himself to realize that this is an occupation, it's an aggression, it's an act of war?
Well, Turkey has definitely been upping the ante of late since its operation to essentially attack Syrian forces within the country. This is something which has been built up for a period. Because of the Idlib operation, Erdogan has been increasing his support to Turkish-backed factions, which some of them work closely with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Idlib, and have essentially been funneling weapons and ammunition and military assistance to a lot of these groups within Idlib to attack the Syrian army in different locations. And previous to the Syrian government-led Idlib offensive, there was a break of the ceasefire, which was actually committed by some of the militant groups within Idlib. So that was a pretext for a lot of the operations which happened recently. And the Syrian army's chief aim of the Idlib operation was actually to secure the M4 and M5 highways, which are the mainstay of the country's transit routes. You know, they want to connect Damascus to Aleppo and Latakia to Aleppo. But what the Turks have effectively done is it built some sort of proxy state within northwestern Syria, and it's their chief interest now to maintain that state, despite what form it actually comes in the sense that you have a lot of extremist groups, terrorist groups, you have some more moderate groups, but they're a minority. I mean, they don't make up the majority of the people in Idlib. So what you now have is a constellation of different militant groups in Idlib, controlled by Turkey effectively, who is now pushing them towards the Syrian army to create a buffer zone. And Operation Spring Shield, whatever these names of Turkish operations are called or given, the main aim is the same. It's either to kill the Kurds in Afrin and other areas, or to take over territory which is Syrian. And in the case of Syria and Idlib, it's now to destroy and attempt to damage the Syrian army. And it has been, to an extent, successful, primarily because Turkey has used drones, and Turkey is quite efficient when it comes to drones. But in the long term, it's unsustainable as an operation. And we've actually seen an initial swing of momentum towards the Syrian army and its allies, because Turkish hits have been, quite plentiful in recent days. But at the moment, since the Russians came in and since the Syrian army-led offensive with allies to retake Sarakeb went ahead and took Sarakeb successfully, Russia has then stated it wants to deploy military police in that city, which is strategic.
Well,
and
you did, Danny, here mention Russia, and Russian President Vladimir Putin tried to get Erdogan out of the problem that he put himself and his troops in, and he tried to tell him, well, you can stay within a depth of 15 kilometers within the Syrian territory, and maybe you can keep up to 60% of Idlib. This is some sources coming out from the Syrian side, but Recep Tayyip Erdogan refused, and he was very much wanting the Syrian army to get out of the Syrian land of Idlib. This war is over in Syria. Literally, it's over. The only thing left is Idlib and the east of the Euphrates. Erdogan still insists on complicating relationships with Syria rather than just opening up to new ties that would open up dialogue and further political solution for the region. Why is he doing this?
Well, Erdogan is acting in this way for a number of reasons. The first reason is to look good domestically, as in, this is a regional statesman, someone who's attempting to assert his hegemony, his dominance over a neighboring country which is witnessing a war. And at the same time, Erdogan is trying to really, provoke Russia with these last actions into some sort of action. And we all know there's a big meeting now on the 5th of March, which is on Thursday, between Putin and Erdogan. And that meeting is effectively going to define the fate of northwestern Syria. Now, Erdogan has kind of seen that there has to be a big meeting between Russia and Turkey. And before that happens, he's going to try and attack and create as much havoc in northwestern Idlib as possible. And Erdogan is effectively trying to, show himself as the big man here. The guy who's taking things by the lead, who's attacking the Syrian army, even when Western countries over the years, and if you remember Barack Obama in 2013 and other U.S. leaders, have really been reluctant to enter that kind of dangerous game with the Russians and the Syrians in Syria. They haven't wanted to target the Syrian army. Erdogan doing that is effectively saying, look, I'm trying to do what you didn't do for the last 9 years. And that's not really going to work when it comes to long-term policy. I mean, it's good for short-term kind of jibes. It's good for social media. It's good for Turkish imagery as being a military force within NATO and a powerful country in the short term.
Well,
but if you look at things from a longer-term strategic perspective, ultimately these actions are not going to reach a specific aim because they're really short-term based.
Given from what you just said, Danny, the NATO refused to help out Erdogan, the US refused to give him Patriot missiles, and we also have voices from within Turkey itself, with the leader of the opposition, who was Kemal Daroglu, who was practically asking a very vital question: what is Turkey doing in Syria? No one is answering him. On the contrary, now Erdogan is investing in the Turkish blood even more in Syria. He's blackmailing Europe by opening up the borders with Europe and allowing an influx of refugees. And we're not talking about Syrian refugees here. We're talking about refugees from all over the world leaving Turkey, entering into Europe. It seems that many people here are unhappy with Erdogan. How do you think this will affect his popularity to begin with on the inside his own country?
Well, you raise a number of important points there. And the first one is Erdogan's popularity within Turkey. Now, we all understand that Erdogan has a very strong popular kind of base within his own supporters, within the AKP party. And that's something which isn't really going to shift hugely based on his decision to attack the Syrian army. But at the same time, there is a long-term opposition to Erdogan within Turkey. And that's something which has been exacerbated through Turkey and Erdogan's actions within the Syria conflict. Well, we've all seen a swathe of opposition figures within Turkey criticize Erdogan's role within that country, and his role to intervene and intercede and really try and provoke the situation and encourage the fanning of the flames within the Syria conflict. And we all know that, for example, the mayor of Istanbul, is a long-term anti-Erdogan figure, and there is a lot of situations in Turkey where you will see such events be mentioned, and Turkey's Syria policy as a chief difference point between internal opposition. So Erdogan has definitely not won any favors internally by sending these Turkish soldiers to be killed. And the fact is, they weren't killed in Turkey. These were killed in Idlib, in an area near to a front line, in an area which was ultimately targeted regularly by Syrian forces, by Russian forces. So Turkish forces were there at their own kind of risk. And Erdogan can really say what he wants with regards to responses and with regards to Turkey being united as a country. But a lot of Turks kind of viewed this as, what we're kind of doing, we have interest within the country, understandably, but what are we really doing in Syria? Is our core interest in Syria to attack the Syrian government or the Syrian military? Well, and that's a really important question, because it's probably not within Turkish national interest to enter a long-term war of attrition with a neighboring Syrian government. It's just
definitely, we're talking about a neighboring country where ties were perfectly well before 2010. But, well, the judiciary system in Turkey is now opening several investigations into social media accounts, journalists. We only have 1 minute left, so I want to talk about the arrests of, for example, the Sputnik team and other Turkish journalists who have been exposing the lies concerning the number of dead soldiers coming from Syria up to Turkey. Why is Erdogan going on a crackdown on these people, and how do you think this will affect whether his operation is going to continue or not in Syria?
Well, just as the Turkish military was effectively decimated in an officer sense by the coup and by Erdogan's subsequent repercussions and consequences of that, we've seen Turkish journalism in general witness that kind of same feature, and this has really just continued on to now, because the Sputnik editors, which is a Russian-based media outlet within Istanbul, were arrested for publishing an article suggesting that the province of Hatay, Liwa Iskenderun in Arabic, is actually a Syrian province. And this really irked Erdogan and some of his supporters. But attacks on the press from Erdogan and the AKP party have been something plentiful. We've seen dozens of Turkish journalists attacked for releasing information, or for even posting anything anti-Erdogan. And we've really seen the Turkish media really have a stronghold on the narrative, the media narrative coming out of Idlib. And that has been reflected in the fact that CRT, for example, which is a Turkish news outlet, has been really showing one side of this conflict and actually publishing maps of where refugees should go into Europe. So it shows you that Erdogan is really controlling the media from that viewpoint and only allowing one narrative to go in.
And that raises a lot of questions concerning why the West, for example, is not talking about this, because they always talk about the freedom of expression and the freedom of speech and democracy, blah, 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 what the West always says, but they seem to now turn a deaf ear to what's going on in Turkey. I want to thank you very much, Dani Mekki, who's a Syrian political analyst, talking to us from London. Hopefully we'll talk to you again to know more about what's going on in Idlib. Thank you for being with us. Please now stay tuned for our next segment about Iraq. Iraqi resistance fighters from the Popular Mobilization Fighters, or the Popular Mobilization Units, PMU, have launched a major operation in the western countryside of Anbar province to hunt down the remnants of the Daesh Takfiri terrorists. Now, PMU attacks ISIS in Anbar in this following report. Iraqi fighters from the Popular Mobilization Units, PMU, better known by the Arabic word Hashd al-Shabi, have launched a major operation in the western countryside of Anbar province to hunt down the remnants of ISIS terrorists. Commander of Anbar operations for the PMU, Qasim Musleh, said in a press statement that his fellow fighters had mounted a multi-pronged offensive codenamed Leaders of Victory on Friday to clear the districts of Medisisa and Saloum Forest. Those areas lie south of the town of Qa'im and nearly 400 kilometers northwest of the capital Baghdad, besides the areas of Akra and Hamid Turkey, Shalij village, and Beit Ajaj region. Hashd al-Sha'bi forces pressed ahead with the operation irrespective of far-flung geographic areas and harsh terrains that terrorists used to either hide or camouflage. Iraqi army forces closely working with the PMU cleared plains in a 4,800 kilometer square area in Anbar during the operation's fifth phase. The forces detained 21 Daesh suspects. On Saturday, the Iraqi army announced that 5 ISIS terrorist fighters were killed and one of the popular mobilization fighters had been martyred near the border with Syria in Karma Island in Anbar province. Other attacks of suspected ISIS terrorists have increased in the past few months, especially in the region between the provinces of Kirkuk, Salah ad-Din to the north, and Diyala to the east, known as the Triangle of Death. Hashd al-Sha'bi's fighters have played a major role in the liberation of Daesh-held areas to the south, northeast, and north of the Iraqi capital ever since the terrorists launched an offensive in the country, overrunning vast swaths in lightning attacks. In 2017, Iraq declared victory over ISIS by reclaiming its entire territory, which was estimated to be about a third of the country's area invaded by the terrorist group in the summer of 2014. But the group still maintains sleeper cells in the large areas of Iraq and launches attacks between varying periods. Now, to discuss the new PMU attacks on ISIS remnants in Anbar, with us in Beirut is Mu'taz al-Wahwah, who's a political analyst. Thank you very much for being with us. Mr. Mu'taz, now Iraqi popular mobilization units have launched a new operation targeting ISIS remnants and sleeper cells in areas of Anbar province, which is bordering both Syria and Jordan. Now, the areas have seen recently upticks in insurgent activity, including bombings and ambushes, kidnapping, arsons, etc. Now, ISIS cannot possibly keep all this up without having funding to do that. Where is that funding still coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. The resurgence, the first major indication of this resurgence was spotted at about October. So just as the civil unrest in Iraq was taking place, and just as the security forces were being diverted or diverting their attention towards keeping the peace in the nation, we saw large portions we saw a large resurgence of ISIS fighters in these areas. So I think to answer your question, if we're going to see where the funding is coming from, it's not improbable that with these protests that were taking place, or a large portion of them at least, those who were coordinating or funding the civil unrest were the same people who were funding and coordinating the resurgence of ISIS. In many areas, and especially in the areas of Salah ad-Din, where we saw civil unrest coming from unknown organizations, unknown supporters of unknown groups, calling for things which were not previously heard of in Iraq, attacking the security forces, forcing them to retreat, or the security forces retreating in order to minimize civilian casualty, only to have ISIS checkpoints all of a sudden pop up. So I think this would be a very interesting scope of investigation, and it appears that it's not far off that those who were fanning or fueling the unrest were at the same time planning for an ISIS resurgence in these areas.
Well, it really amazes me how the Western mainstream media does not even ask about what the role of the so-called US-led coalition in fighting ISIS, if it were actually the popular mobilization forces and units who were fighting off Daesh in Iraq, all across Iraq now. This brings us to ask, how will this Western mainstream media explain even the airstrikes against the popular mobilization forces, who are the only forces capable and effectively eliminating Daesh from Iraq, while the US just leaves the Anbar province untouched?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting question. You see, the area in question is a very vast area, and it's mainly desert. So with an effective air force such as the US Air Force, it is very easy to pick out these targets, and it will be very hard for ISIS to actually hide from the Air Force. And from January up until this very day, we've had excessive activity of the US Air Force over Iraq. But as you said, it is not interested at all in facing ISIS. Their main objective seems to be, from January up until now, is the PMU. So this brings into question here that is the United States and the coalition, are they serious about fighting ISIS? It appears that they're not. It appears that they are more serious and more concerned about fighting the Hashd al-Shabi, fighting their allies. And this was clear evidence when we discussed the assassination of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Haj Qasim Soleimani. It is very, very evident that the United States is actually here working in favor of ISIS, whether the Western media would like to admit it or not. If
they're practically the ISIS Air Force.
Pretty much they are today ISIS's Air Force. If they sincerely wanted to fight ISIS, it would take a very mediocre air campaign, which they can very easily carry out with their Air Force there in Iraq, but they've deliberately refused to do so.
Well, Mu'taz, in an interview with the French media in February, we heard Kurdistan region of Iraq Prime Minister Masroor Barzani saying that there is a great possibility that ISIS will stage a comeback in Iraq. Now, specifically, he's talking about territories that are under dispute between the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and the federal government in Baghdad. Why would he say that, this statement, at this particular point in time?
Well, I think the issue with Kurdistan is a very delicate one. You see, on one hand, the Kurds, they're victims of ISIS terror, and were it not for the PMU and direct Iranian involvement, as admitted by the Kurds, and direct involvement by Haj Qasim Soleimani, then the Kurdish provinces of Iraq would have been overrun overnight by ISIS. However, at the same time, in order to maintain or to justify US support for this particular region of Iraq, it appears that ISIS has been deliberately kept lingering there. Otherwise there'd be no justification for having this direct military involvement or direct military support by the United States for Iraqi Kurdistan. So it seems like ISIS has been kept as a bargaining chip there, and it seems to, according to at least a few analysts within Iraq at the moment, that Kurdistan is, or the Kurdish government is currently using ISIS as a blackmailing chip or a bargaining chip in order to gain more autonomous liberties and to gain further autonomy over their regions and to slowly disengage from Baghdad.
Well, eager to move on, we did hear US President Donald Trump declare winning over ISIS, victory over ISIS more than once, actually even more than twice, if I could remember well. Nevertheless, this reality on the ground suggests that a definitive end to the war against Daesh is far out from the reach of the Americans, that if we were to accept to begin with that they were actually fighting against ISIS and Daesh to eliminate it from Iraq. But for sure, the assassination of Lieutenant General Qasim Soleimani in Iraq turned the tide against the U.S. But where does that actually put the U.S. presence in the region with Qasim Soleimani out of the picture, say Haj Mahdi Muhandis out of the picture, but the PMU now even continuing with full force against ISIS?
Well, as you pointed out, it is, I think it's very comical to suggest that the US was ever in a fight against ISIS. I mean, with the amount of military equipment and the amount of military presence the United States have, what they contributed to the war on ISIS is absolutely nothing. It's laughable. It's a joke. If anything, this we've seen for the last few years, at the very least since 2015, several instances where the PMU would be advancing against ISIS and the United States and the coalition air force would actually get up, whether it be in Syria or in Iraq, and they would bomb or target the resistance factions fighting against ISIS. So to claim that the United States has been engaged in this war for some time and then to claim victory in defeating ISIS is laughable. The PMU, the resistance factions, those allied with both Iraqi, Syrian governments and also the Iranian governments, they have been at the forefront of the war against ISIS. Shahid Qasim Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis were the greatest threat to the presence of ISIS, and if anyone is going to celebrate the victory, it is going to be them. As a matter of fact, and this is by the the admission of ISIS commanders and supporters that the removal of Qasim Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis has served them a massive favor. And we saw them celebrating in the streets, and we saw them celebrating on social media, and they stopped short of thanking President Trump for eliminating who they could not eliminate. I think right now what the United States has done is they have placed themselves in a bit of a quagmire in the Middle East. They have chosen to take on the resistance front, the PMU and its allies. They have decided to take them head on, and from the beginning of January up until now, but I think it's safe to say that the coalition and the United States in particular has not had one night's rest in Iraq.
I want to thank you very much, Mr. Mu'taz al-Wahwah, political analyst with us from Beirut, to talk to us about the new PMU mission against ISIS in Anbar province of Iraq. Thank you for being with us and for your contribution to our show. Please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.